My name is Rebecca Mitchell, and I never thought I'd be in the middle of the biggest property scandal Newport, Rhode Island had seen in a century. But when you marry into old money, you learn that some families will do anything to keep their wealth and their secrets. The Blackwood family had ruled Newport's social scene since the Gilded Age. Their summer cottage, really a 30-room mansion overlooking the Atlantic, was the crown jewel of Bellevue Avenue. When their only son Thomas fell in love with me, a mere historical preservation specialist from the Newport Historical Society, his parents were less than thrilled. "At least she has some appreciation for history," Victoria Blackwood had said during our first meeting, examining me like I was an artifact of questionable provenance. If only she'd known then just how much that appreciation would cost her. The small beach house that started everything had been in my family for generations. Nothing fancy, just a weathered 2-story cottage with wraparound porches and salt-sprayed windows, sitting on 3 acres of pristine oceanfront property. My great-grandfather, a ship captain, had bought it in 1925 for a song, back when that stretch of coast was considered too remote to be valuable. Now that same worthless stretch was prime real estate, worth millions per acre. The Blackwoods had been trying to buy up the entire coastline for their latest development project, a luxury resort that would restore Newport to its former glory. As my father-in-law Charles loved to say, my beach house was the last holdout, a stubborn reminder that not everything in Newport was for sale. At least that's what I thought until Thomas lost everything in a series of disastrous investments. "It's not your fault, darling," I'd said, holding him as he confessed how badly he'd screwed up. "We'll figure something out." But the Blackwoods had already figured it out. They knew their son's weakness for risky ventures had probably encouraged it. Now they had the leverage they needed. The family dinner was set for a Friday evening at Marble House, their summer mansion. Everything about it felt wrong from the moment we arrived. The butler directed me to sit at the far end of the massive dining table, separated from Thomas by the length of polished mahogany. "Rebecca, dear," Victoria began, her voice dripping with false concern. "We need to discuss Thomas's situation." Charles didn't bother with pleasantries. He pulled out a thick folder and slid it across the table. "Your husband owes $2.7 million to some very impatient people who aren't as understanding as family." My hands shook slightly as I opened the folder. Inside were loan documents, investment records, and finally, a deed transfer for my beach house. "The property is worth at least $5 million, Victoria added, as if she were doing me a favor. "Sign it over, and we'll clear Thomas's debts." "Refuse?" She glanced meaningfully at her son, who wouldn't meet my eyes. "You'll make sure he divorces me," I finished quietly. "And I suppose these impatient people would make his life very difficult." Charles smiled thinly. "You always were clever, Rebecca. Perhaps too clever for your own good." I looked at Thomas, still staring at his plate. 5 years of marriage, of love and trust, crumbling in a single evening. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd spent those 5 years doing more than just playing the dutiful daughter-in-law. Working at the Historical Society had its advantages. I'd seen the original property surveys, the old maps that the town's founding families thought were safely buried in archives. I knew secrets about the Newport coastline that even the Blackwoods, with all their generations of wealth, didn't know. "May I at least pack up my family's belongings?" I asked, signing the transfer with steady hands. "Of course, dear," Victoria purred. "Take the weekend. We'll start demolition on Monday." I drove home alone that night, leaving Thomas to celebrate with his parents. The beach house was dark when I arrived, but I didn't need light to find what I was looking for. In my grandfather's old study, behind a loose panel of weathered wainscoting, lay the true treasure of the property, documents that would shake the Blackwoods empire to its foundations. My great-grandfather hadn't just bought a beach house in 1925. He bought something far more valuable, something the original owners had desperately tried to hide. And on Monday, when the Blackwoods demolition crew arrived, they would find out exactly what they'd taken from the wrong person. I spent that weekend methodically preparing, just as I had been for the past 5 years. Every document was copied and securely stored. Every piece of evidence carefully cataloged. I'd learned from the Blackwoods themselves that power isn't just about money. It's about knowing when and how to use what you know. Sunday night, as I packed the last box into my car, I took one final walk along the beach. The waves crash against the shore, constant and eternal, just as they had when my great-grandfather first bought this land. He'd known its true value wasn't in the building or even the location. The real value lay beneath the surface, in secrets that had been waiting nearly a century to be revealed. Monday morning would change everything. And as I drove away from my family home for what the Blackwoods thought was the last time, I smiled, thinking of Victoria's smug face at dinner. She'd been right about one thing. I did have an appreciation for history. What she hadn't realized was that history had a way of coming back to haunt those who tried to bury it. Monday morning dawned bright and clear. I sat in my car across from the beach house, watching the Blackwoods demolition crew arrive. Victoria and Charles were there too, of course. They never missed a chance to gloat. I could see Victoria gesturing grandly, probably already planning where their luxury resort's main entrance would be. At exactly 9:00 a.m., just as Charles was raising a ceremonial sledgehammer for the cameras, 3 black SUVs pulled up. The men and women who stepped out weren't construction workers or reporters. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood. A tall woman in a dark suit flashed her credentials. I'm Agent Sarah Martinez, FBI Historical Artifacts Division. This property has been designated a protected historical site. All demolition activities need to cease immediately. The look on Victoria's face was worth every moment of the past 5 years. You see, what my great-grandfather Captain James Henderson bought in 1925 wasn't just oceanfront property. He purchased something the original owners, the Blackwoods' own ancestors, had desperately tried to keep hidden. Proof of one of the largest historical art thefts in American history. During World War II, countless European art treasures were smuggled to America for safekeeping. Most were returned after the war. But some, particularly those belonging to Jewish families who didn't survive the Holocaust, mysteriously disappeared. The original Blackwood patriarch, Theodore Blackwood, had built a sophisticated underground vault system beneath the coastline, using it to store and later sell priceless artworks. My great-grandfather discovered this by accident while renovating the beach house. Instead of exposing the truth, he documented everything meticulously, knowing the time would come when this information would be crucial. This is absurd, Charles sputtered, his face turning an alarming shade of red. We have all the proper permits. Actually, I said, stepping forward with a thick folder, you don't. The original 1925 property survey, which I recently submitted to the Historical Society's archives, shows extensive underground structures that were never included in any subsequent property records. Agent Martinez nodded. Structures that match the descriptions of storage facilities used in one of the largest art theft operations of the 1940s. Victoria's composure finally cracked. You have no proof. Oh, but I do, I interrupted softly. My great-grandfather kept very detailed records. Photographs, shipping manifests, even letters from your grandfather, Theodore Blackwood, discussing how to handle inquiries from Holocaust survivors' families about their missing collections. The next few hours were chaos. As FBI agents swarmed the property with ground-penetrating radar equipment, I sat in Agent Martinez's vehicle, explaining everything. How I discovered my great-grandfather's documents shortly after marrying Thomas. How I'd spent years quietly verifying every detail, building an ironclad case. How I'd waited, knowing the Blackwoods would eventually show their true colors. The vault network extends under multiple properties along the coast. I explained, spreading out the old surveys. The beach house was just the access point. That's why they were so desperate to get this particular piece of land. By afternoon, the story had broken nationally. FBI uncovers World War II art theft ring in Newport Mansion, screamed the headlines. Reporters swarmed Bellevue Avenue as agents carried box after box of documents from the Blackwood mansion. Thomas found me that evening, sitting on the beach house's porch swing. He looked lost, younger somehow, without his family's wealth and influence to shield him. Did you know? He asked quietly. When you married me, did you know about all this? I shook my head. I discovered it after. I kept hoping you'd prove to be different from them. That's why I waited so long to come forward. He sat beside me, watching the waves. I'm sorry, he said finally, for being too weak to stand up to them, for letting them manipulate me. I know, and I did know. Thomas had been as much a victim of his family's toxic legacy as anyone. What will you do now? Cooperate with the investigation, he said firmly. It's time the truth came out. All of it. Over the next year, the full scope of the Blackwood art theft operation was revealed. Hundreds of artworks, worth billions, were recovered and returned to the descendants of their rightful owners. Charles and Victoria, along with several other wealthy Newport families implicated in the scheme, faced federal charges. The beach house was indeed declared a historical site, but not for its architecture. It became a memorial and museum dedicated to telling the story of the stolen art and the families who had lost so much. I stayed on as its historical director, working with Holocaust survivor groups to ensure their stories were properly told. Thomas and I separated amicably. He moved to Boston, started over in a regular job, and began the long process of becoming his own person outside his family's shadow. We still talk occasionally. Healing is possible, even from the deepest wounds. As for the Blackwood's luxury resort plans, the entire stretch of coastline was eventually designated as protected land, its underground vaults carefully preserved as historical evidence. Victoria's dream of restoring Newport to its former glory died alongside the family's carefully constructed reputation. Last week, I found a new document while organizing my great-grandfather's papers. It was a letter he'd written but never sent, dated 1946. To whoever finds these records, I couldn't stop what happened, but I could make sure the truth survived. Sometimes justice takes time, but history has a way of emerging when it's most needed. Guard these secrets well and use them wisely. I did use them wisely, Grandpa, not for revenge, but for justice. Not to destroy, but to restore. Now, when I sit on my porch swing watching the sunset, I think about power, not the kind that comes from money or social status, but the kind that comes from knowing the truth and having the patience to wait for the right moment to reveal it. Victoria was right about one thing. I do have an appreciation for history. What she never understood was that history isn't just about preserving the past. It's about learning from it, making amends for it, and sometimes using it to right ancient wrongs. The beach house still stands, its weathered shingles and salt-sprayed windows telling a story far different from what anyone could have imagined. It's no longer just my family's home. It's a testament to the fact that truth, like the tide, cannot be held back forever. And sometimes the most valuable treasures aren't gold or artwork or oceanfront property. Sometimes they're the simple things: truth, justice, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. As for me, I'm still here, still telling the story to visitors who come to the museum. Not just the story of the stolen art, but the story of how one family's greed led to their downfall, and how sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's letting the truth finally have its day in the sun. The waves still crash against the shore, constant and eternal, but now they carry a different message. Some things are worth more than money, some secrets are worth keeping until the right time, and some victories are worth waiting generations to achieve. Just ask the Blackwoods, if you can find them in their new, much more modest accommodations.